Hey, are you hiring? If you answered yes, let XenTegra Staffing help staff your IT people needs. Head over to XenTegra.com/XenTegra Staffing to find out more. XenTegra Staffing, we can staff your IT people needs. Welcome to another edition of the Citrix Session with your hosts, Andy Whiteside and Bill Sutton, your source for all things Citrix.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 43 of the Citrix Session podcast. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside. I've got with me Bill Sutton, the Director of Delivery Services at XenTegra. Bill, how's it going? Can you believe this is episode 43 already?
No, it's hard to believe. We've just been moving through these things. I'm doing fine this morning. Thank you.
And I'll use that as an opportunity to tell people, part of the goal here is for us to host these things and learn. And I was sharing this with a bunch of other people this morning and making sure they know that, every time I do these, I learn stuff. I'm sure you do too, Bill. It's just a great way to challenge yourself and learn more. And the truth is, a lot of IT guys think they know it all, but none of us know anywhere close to it all.
I've learned a number of things from doing these podcasts, and I suspect that based on the topic of today's, I'm going to have an opportunity to learn a whole lot more.
Yeah. Well, that's a good transition. So we've got Chris Doran with us. Chris, we're going to be covering Chris is our networking practice leader, and a big part of XenTegra's networking practice is Citrix networking as it relates to Citrix ADCs. We'll call them NetScalers sometimes during this, I'm sure, as well as Citrix SD-WAN and a bunch of other stuff that makes up route switch and app firewall and other things that make up a network as part of someone's solution. Hey, Chris, how's it going?
Very good. Thanks for having me.
Today's blog that we're covering is called Manage the Complete SSL Certificate Lifecycle Using Citrix ADM. I am not the biggest fan of certificates. I've supported them in the past. I've implemented them. I can't tell you I truly understand everything about them by any means. I guess I know more than a lot of people, but interesting to cover this topic today on this blog. And this was written by Asit Mohapatra. I think that's how I'm pronouncing his name. And I can't remember if we reached out to him or not, but this was kind of short notice, and we want to get Chris on here. Chris, what you got, about 8, 9, 10 years of Citrix ADC networking experience at this point?
Yes. About that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, so before we jump into this, let's talk about last week. So I think there were some vulnerabilities announced on the Citrix ADC product, and that's nothing bad, really. I mean, I'd rather have a company that's announcing vulnerabilities and fixing them than pretending they don't exist. And for many, many years in IT, people just pretend they didn't exist, and we just had to live with them. But now, Citrix is very proactive about these things that are, internet facing and living on the edge. And so if you've got, Chris, you want to just cover real quick what was announced last week in terms of vulnerabilities and what people should do?
Yeah, so there were a couple of CVEs that were released, I think 3 total in this public statement that they came out with a couple vulnerabilities that are addressed with firmware upgrades, and it applied to the 13.0 stack and 12.1 for the ADCs. And some of the SD-WAN appliances as well. So they came back and stated that it can be covered with the firmware upgrades. And what we've noticed in practice is that running to the newest 13.0 can cause some issues with some of your LDAP authentication. So there's a circumventing post about how to change the global post for the VPN traffic policy and action that you would typically use at a pretty basic level for single sign-on. It seems to have buggered it up a little bit, so it's something that you're going to want to keep in mind right now when we're going down the path of upgrading those to take care of the vulnerabilities that were addressed last week. It seems that the 12.0 stack, though, was not affected. So folks running 12.0 builds are okay right now. And if you notice in the portal, there is not a brand new release for the 12.0 stack, but you'll see for the 12.1 and 13.0, there are newer ones. We'll go into those cautiously, though.
Yeah. Okay. And would it be fair to say at this point that people running Citrix ADCs should probably have at least a once a month look-see to figure out if it's time to patch something, as well as trying to keep their ear to the ground with alerts and things that Citrix and others put out.
Yeah,
there.
definitely. So, I mean, regardless if it's something that they're trying to catch up on and playing kind of reactive measures too, if you should have something in your environment, especially USDX shops, where you have the ability to provision instances and kind of step through some of these upgrades to see how they're going to handle with your users. Definitely an area where folks that have invested the time and efforts into their testing environments are going to come out a little bit ahead.
Right. Okay. Well, regarding this this blog, help us understand what they're covering here in the first section in the intro.
So really what it comes back to, this is one of the two main reasons to use ADM regardless of your version. And that means that we all know that in order to enable HDX Insight ICA traffic, there's different licensing models that you have to have applied to your ADCs in order to procure and audit and hold that information for reporting purposes. Well, even if you're on a standard version of the ADC firmwares, and that's your licensing model, then you're entitled to, and you have the perks of putting ADM into your infrastructure, not only to automatically back up your appliances, but another perk that comes out of that is the SSL management. Yeah. So we can see that's what we're going to tackle today.
Well, a quick note, we did the normal IT guy thing, right? I started talking about ADCs and just assumed everybody knows what an ADC is, Application Delivery Controller, Citrix Application Delivery Controller in this case. And then I mentioned it in the title, and you mentioned just now Citrix ADM, which is an application delivery management solution that Citrix has to manage your ADCs in orchestration. You want to just do a quick blurb on what an ADM is?
So the application delivery manager is a virtual appliance that lives either in your host inside of your infrastructure, or it's a subscription version in Citrix Cloud that you can go either way with it. The on-prem one had traditionally been a rolling kind of technology that snowballed to incorporate multiple different standalone products into one now. So we used to have the control center, command center, HDX Insight, and then that kind of, when they collapsed all those into one virtual appliance, we started to see the HDX Insight become the leader, then MAS for management and analytical system, and then they renamed it to the Application Delivery Manager, which is where we're at now.
Okay, great. So in the blog, they actually have a section here still in the introduction where it kind of highlights what you manage from an SSL certificate perspective. I'm just going to read through this. Number one, create of SCR, certificate request, and SSL certificate, installation of the certificates, monitoring the SSL certificates and SSL negotiation transactions. Sounds like a lot of fun, but definitely something that is part of all this. Notification about expiring certs. I've never had a cert expire on me.
Okay. You're lucky then. I know, I was kidding.
That is an oh crap moment when that happens, right?
Usually over a holiday or like a Saturday night when it happens to folks.
Amazing. I don't know how that happens, but updating expired certificates and deletion of unused certificates. There's nothing like going and looking at someone's NetScaler and seeing certificates from way back when that have nothing to do with anything these days, still sitting out there causing security concerns.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so let's break these down. Creation of a CSR, certificate service request. Am I saying that right? And SSL certificate.
Signing request.
Signing request. There you go.
Yep. So we can tackle that all in the ADM now, so that key pair's stuck there, and then we can distribute it from the ADM after that's completed and all bound together.
Being CSRs from Windows boxes and moving them over and stuff like that?
Not from the Windows side. So that's kind of where folks will say you got that balance of, well, am I only really handling the certificates for the NetScalers, or if I have like a wild card per se, and you're going to have to put them onto the IIS servers for storefront, and say you're an environment that only has like 2 of them. Sometimes it's a little easier to just procure that from the IIS side versus the ADM. But when you do it with the ADM, you're kind of preloading it in there so that it's aware of it and it doesn't have to pull back to the ADCs to find that.
Cool.
Hey, I've got a question for you guys, and it's going to be along this topic of what you guys were just talking about, IIS certs and Windows certs versus these Unix, Linux-based certs. For a while now, and this is going to show my ignorance, but you've been able to use a GUI, open SSL type of GUI on the net, convert from one format to another, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So you have the ability to have, like on my laptop that I take into the field, I have a standalone open SSL. So I can do those conversions as needed and convert your PFX formats into PEM formats or DIR formats, and then take that into the NetScaler. And that's really helpful, especially with our customers that have had older versions like the CAGs, where they might not necessarily have the ability to convert those, or the certificates become newer to the point where the OpenSSL can't handle it. So you can do it at the NetScaler, or you can also install that on a standalone box and take care of that yourself. But the newer versions, as we push through about midway through what we're at with 13.0 in the later versions of 12.1, you do now have the ability to just straight install the PFX version of the certificates as well. And I'll tell you, the only real gotcha you have at that point is if you are to ingest that PFX version into your NetScaler and you had to roll back to an older version that didn't support it, then it will not become active on the NetScaler at that point. So that's something just to keep in mind if you're going to go down the path of not converting it or downloading it directly for like an Apache web service version from your public CA. There's a little bit of just to be aware of that's only based on some of the newer versions of the ADC firmware that'll be able to tackle that for you.
Okay, good. All right, I think this is going to be a lot of, yes, that, and yes, checkbox type stuff, but let's go through all these. So installation of the certificates, again, sounds like that's something that's ADM doable these days?
Yes. So yeah, the ADM, it's not a whole lot different than if you were to push like a rolling upgrade of firmware through all of your ADCs, that the certificate management will do that as well.
So this next section, I'm kind of excited about the idea of monitoring the SSL interactions and negotiations. That seemed like a very valuable piece of information people would want in an ADM being able to provide that rolling up through the NetScalers or ADCs.
Yeah, this can really help with determining what kind of folks are connecting from the client side. If they're using older receiver versions that might not be able to handle some of the newer ciphers and key strengths, we can see who's leading the pack in that regard. So where you're going to focus tackling to become as secure as you possibly can be for delivering that remote access.
Yeah, that seems like something you'd want to take a look at every month and just get an idea of who needs to be upgrading their endpoints, who's weakening your security posture.
Yeah, definitely. But it also comes into the upgrade where, especially now that we're in that work from home kind of situation, and a lot of folks are not using corporate managed or owned appliances and laptops and desktops to connect to their work infrastructure. So they're kind of unmanageable, and we need to see what they're connecting with. So I currently have a project where we have this come up right now, just this morning, and it's like, well, am I going to leave all my clients stranded if we do push through this upgrade? And it's like, well, you possibly could. To circumvent that, we might use the current default list that they had applied and make a custom cipher group out of that default list that's on that current version that they are running, just so we can take that into the newer versions of the ADC firmware.
That's great. Okay, next section here, inventory of expiring and expired SSL certs. Probably pretty straightforward, but what do we cover here?
Yeah, that definitely can help us with the with just the cleanup of it. A lot of times anymore, for the past couple of years, I like to rename the certificates or use a friendly name that kind of addresses the year, at least that we're putting them into practice. But regardless, if they've been running ADC for any given amount of time, there's going to be some in there that are old and abandoned that need to be cleaned up and deleted. So this section of kind of helping us see what's not needed any longer. Really helps kind of clean things up. They don't take up a lot of space on the ADCs by any means, so it's not like it's bloating your storage. But as you're scrolling through those pages and trying to decipher on what's active and what's not, it's always going to be recommended that you take some kind of effort to scroll through them and clean up. You can always right-click the virtual servers at the ADCs too, and or the certificates, and see what they're bound to, and that'll give you kind of a direction as well. So 2 ways of kind of taking a look at that.
Hey, Chris?
Yes.
Does this remove the files from the actual certificate files for expired certificates from the appliances, the ADCs themselves?
That's a good question. So do they sit out there after they're kind of deleted? Because as we know, like when you install a certificate, it might have been sitting on the NetScaler anyway, but it's not technically active to install it unless you take that extra effort for deleting that flat file. But yeah, you can delete them from the ADM.
Okay, perfect.
As we see there's also some notifications that we can have prompted for us. So there's integration now with Slack, email, SMS, ServiceNow, and PagerDuty. So you can be alerted inside of your there's a couple here that that you probably have up in front of your face on one of your monitors at any given time throughout the day, and it can notify you. So there's a little bit of help there.
So, Chris, are you telling me that my old school way of naming the certificate with the year and the date in it, that's not good enough across the board? I'm joking.
It very much helps, though.
Yeah.
So it's nice to see.
But the minute somebody comes behind you and has maybe a good naming convention, just different format, all of a sudden, what good is it? So I get it. You need to. It's like script management or code management tools. Just saving each file with a unique name is probably not the best way to edit your code.
No, but it comes back to SSL certificates and knowing what you're looking at. It's the same with the license files as well. So very helpful to just take that extra 5 seconds to rename those files before you upload them and bind them into the appliances.
All right, so the next section here is titled Ensuring Compliance to Enterprise Policy. What's this covering?
So we're looking at recommended key strengths, the signature algorithms, how trusted is that CA, and the protocols that are in use there. So these are big components of trying to tackle and achieve that A+ rating that a lot of folks are getting into, applying extra security into their environment. We want to see what's being used. So we're kind of in a dashboard here where we're red, yellow, green on what our strengths are. And we want to try to push as close as we can to green so that we can achieve those higher security recommendations and requirements that folks have anymore. And this can help us see inside of that and gain some insight for how we're going to tackle that.
All right. I mean, this is all about having a holistic view as well as the ability to act upon what needs to be done, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
All right. Updating SSL certs.
Yeah, so we can definitely use tasks. We build off of templates to push the SSL certificates to the different appliances. So you can either update or push new. So you have some options there on distributing these into your environment, and not a problem at all for anything that's load balanced, gateway based, or just straight virtual server load balancers, content switching, GSLB. We can bind those and update the certificates that are present on those VIPs from the ADM.
All right. And then I think we talked about this several times already, but deleting unused certificates, I think there's the outstanding question, what happens to the actual certificate files? But as far as them being in the management system of the ADCs, that for sure can be done from here, right?
Yes. Get them out of there.
Get them out of there where they can't be used. All right. And then, Chris, as far as getting started and taking advantages, I should have said this earlier. We were talking about the firmware upgrades, obviously something that XenTegra can help with. But as far as people getting into this and using it to manage their certificates, what can they do?
Well, they can access Citrix.com, jump right into the download section. You have the ability to download a virtual appliance for your favorite hypervisor version, and you simply deploy it with the console access, and you're asked a couple questions. And as you step through it, you give it the IP address, DNS name, DNS servers, some of that basic setup. You'll want to come back into it, and there's a a Perl script you need to run quite after it to determine and tell the ADM the version or the method that it's going to be deployed. So you want to stand alone, by itself, or you have some of those options too if you're using the ADM agent. But then after that second reboot, then it's kind of finalized, and then you can access it through the GUI and take control of it from that point.
Now, I have to assume that people who've been managing NetScalers and ADCs for a long time, when they finally get into the ADM world, it's got to be enlightening for them, especially based on where the thing's at now.
Yeah, it's a breath of fresh air. So it definitely, we put it in for a couple years and different customers of XenTegra's, and I didn't necessarily see it take off right off the bat. It might have been a year before I came back around and saw folks actually utilizing it for troubleshooting and kind of shifting their efforts that they would take from first level calls coming into the environment, whereas you traditionally had turned around and ran back into your Citrix farm or site looking for trouble, like what terminal server are they on, and trying to see the perfmon counts and looking for event viewer marks. Well, anymore, you could, circumvent some of that effort that you're putting into troubleshooting and shift it back to, well, how's the client connecting? Because now we have so much more of our workforce anymore working remotely and coming in over the public internet that we could use that as the first stop and kind of see how they're connecting. Are they having problems logging in just to the gateway, or they got some crazy round trip time that's hindering the performance of their Citrix session when they're in there? So it definitely is super helpful from the troubleshooting, especially at the level 1.
Yeah, that holistic view has got to be great. And, ideally, if you're doing ADC right, you got them in the cloud, you got them at the edge, you got them in multiple data centers, and it's protecting you everywhere you can. But at the same time, if you can't see it and manage it from one central place, you've just maybe created your own problem.
Yeah, very much so. Very possible to create your own problem. It's also neat. If you already have this in place or you're going to go down that route, it also readies you for what's coming with the discussions with Citrix on using the pool capacity for your ADCs. So the ADM becomes the licensing server that your ADCs will reach back to, regardless if it's CPX, BLX, SDX. They're going to check into that ADM. So kind of you're knocking out a lot of birds with one stone here by deploying this into your environment.
Yeah, the people listening to the podcast can't see this, but this is my opportunity to use my favorite G.I. Joe, knowing is half the battle line. All right. Well, Chris, thanks for joining and going through this. Bill, any thoughts, questions, comments?
No, it's just good stuff.
Chris, anything you want to let us know before we wrap up here?
I mean, again, regardless of your version, you want to go ahead and start dabbling in the ADM and download that and deploy it into your environment. You'll want to create a profile as you start adding your instances or your appliances with a secure username and password so it can log into the ADCs and try to inventory and do some discovery of those ADCs, and then it'll start populating stuff. Don't get discouraged or upset if you're deploying it in a lab and you only have like 1 or 2 users and you're not generating a whole lot of traffic. It's not uncommon to see that take a little while for little bits and pieces to show up, versus if you were to deploy it in an environment that has like maybe 200 plus sessions running on it while you're deploying it, you're going to almost instantly start seeing a lot of traffic. So don't get discouraged if it's kind of a small shop or a lab environment that you're kicking the tires on this in order to actually have data to scroll through and see a lot of those perks. You need some traffic to actually be present in there.
Yeah. And it used to be ADM was for people that had more than a handful, and now it's for anybody who has one. It has so many other benefits than you wouldn't get just running one ADC, one NetScaler.
Exactly.
All right, gentlemen. Well, thanks for joining. It's another good session, and we'll do it again next week.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah.
We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Citrix Session with your hosts, Andy Whiteside and Bill Sutton. A special thanks to our guest for attending today's podcast. Podcast produced by Pete Downing. For any input, or if you'd like to be a part of our podcast, please email us at info@XenTegra.com. Please head over to XenTegra.com/podcast to listen to all podcasts in this series. This podcast is copyrighted by XenTegra LLC.